All right, today we're going to talk in this session about some cloud stuff that may not be the typical cloud conversation that you would normally hear. We've got a couple of incredibly forward-thinking guys that have seen a lot in the industry around architecture and cloud and just systems evolution in general. And they've got some pretty unique perspectives on how this stuff is going to play out, how it's been playing out, and where we're going to take it from here. So what we'll do is we'll get into some Q&A. About halfway through, I'll pause and ask for a couple of questions. The sessions go much better if you guys ask questions, so think about what you want to ask and then get an opportunity to make it a little more interactive, a little more personal. It helps the dialogue. I want to make sure you guys are getting out of this what you want. So why don't we start with a brief background from each of you, and you've all done so much, we could spend the whole session just on your backgrounds, but why don't you keep it pithy? And we'll move along quick. So Biri, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having us here, Billy, and welcome to everyone. Hope you're having a good conference. So my background is I'm about 23 years in IT, most of it all in software, infrastructure, data center, networking, comms, and equally split between sort of startup and large companies. So most recently, I did a couple of years at HP. I was running the cloud business there. Before that, worked with Guri here at IBM for just over 3 years. Got there through an acquisition of one of my startups. Before that, did about a decade plus in a bunch of different startups, everything from networking to SaaS companies and a few in between. And then cut my teeth as a product manager at Nortel back in the early 90s. So deep infrastructure background, sort of my thing. I took some time off, hanging out, and enjoying the summer and the great weather.
Fantastic. You're here in the Bay Area, right?
I am.
And Guri?
Well, on that note, I'm based in Dallas. And Biri.
Breaking my heart.
And
breaking my heart. I moved from Dallas, for those that don't know. I'm not a fan of the Bay Area, for those that don't know. So,
Not yet, anyway.
So Biri can almost speak for IBM since he's been over there. I'm currently at IBM, and most of you might know IBM has a services division, a hardware division, and a software division. I'm currently in a role which spans those three divisions, representing most of the cloud computing offerings from that division, about 60 to 70%. There's some that I don't. And I represent those for the solution and architecture leadership for our customers in the West region. Most of my customers happen to be in the Bay Area, so we could swap places over here logistically, right?
Great.
And previous to that, so I've been in infrastructure. I'm deeply immersed in cloud, as you can imagine right now, which really started with the uptake of virtualization, and we'll probably touch upon some of that little bit later. But I went up and down the stack in the sense I started my career in virtualization, building out the worldwide peer-to-peer network, the largest at that time for Motorola. And then during .com, I went up the stack when there was a massive rebuild of applications. So I went into application areas. And then the last area of my background, somewhere in the middle, was around embedded systems. So I was doing system engineering for wireless embedded Linux before it became popular in the tablet form factors today.
Great. So actually, it's good sequitur. You talked about started in the virtualization world. Let's go back to set the context of the rest of the conversation. Take us back 3 years, 5 years. What were the conversations, the really meaningful conversations going on in enterprises around cloud? What did it mean to people back then? How did they define it? How did they think about it?
So if I look back, I'll actually extend your question a little bit more on the time horizon, Billy. So if I look back about 5, 6 years, most customers that I was dealing with, most customers that we were dealing with, they were anywhere from 0 to 10% virtualized. Cloud wasn't very popular. And today, most customers are anywhere from 40 to 60, 70, 80% virtualized. Cloud is very popular, very central to their planning. If you go back 2, 3 years as far as cloud is concerned, most were looking at kicking the tires. Most were looking at taking the low-risk environments like test dev environments onto the cloud. Most were looking at take email to the cloud. Most were looking at take desktop, virtualize it, or take desktop and put it on the cloud. Now, all those have massive operational efficiency implications. massive labor implications, skill set implications. But where we are now is in a totally different game where it's central to the strategic planning of CIOs and also to business units that are technology intensive, thereby changing the business models in certain cases and no longer just an operational efficiency play. It's the business model revenue growth kind of a play. So
yeah, one follow-up on that before we go to Biri. You even in our introduction call, you seem to mention virtualization right away every time we talk about cloud. Are you saying those two things are correlated, or just, you know, are you seeing that as a fundamental part of being in the cloud? Why do you bring that up every time I ask about it?
Yeah, great question, Billy. If we look at it definitionally, virtualization is not a prerequisite to have a cloud. There are other characteristics to have a cloud. But the reason virtualization always comes up hand in hand in a cloud conversation is because of multi-tenancy, is because of sharing of resources, is because of pooling of resources. So if you don't do virtualization and try to create a cloud, architecturally you can do it, but economically it'll just become cost prohibitive. Either within your own enterprise environment, and especially if you're a cloud provider where the economics absolutely have to scale along with the technology and the resources behind it.
Great, thanks for clearing that up. So, Biri, 5 years ago, time machine, what did it look
Sure.
like?
So
and where were you 5 years ago?
I'd just actually gotten to IBM.
Okay.
And so I was running a startup in the identity space. So we were actually doing identity around risk and compliance. So think 2007, 2008. AWS has launched. It's a couple of years into it, and they're sort of still in, you know, active learning mode. You've got VMware, back to the virtualization story, at EMC now and starting to scale and going from taking its customers down a journey, as Guri talked about. So I think one of the interesting pointers that was in everyone's minds back then is, all right, so we're seeing this virtualization thing sort of unfold. Similar to Guri, my point of view is I think the virtualization path is a precursor to what we call cloud. It's not necessarily a requirement, and they're actually fundamentally very different architecturally, other than sharing sort of common themes around multi-tenancy and such. But they've had an interesting way. I think one has informed the other, and now what we call cloud is certainly sort of, I think, enveloping all of these pieces. So I think virtualization was big on everyone's mind. If you look at all the large vendors, everyone was sort of laying out their parallel universe storyline for how they're going to tackle virtualization. That's happening in cloud now. It's been happening for the last couple of years. And then the other thing that I think had popped up was infrastructure as a service was getting widely known. And the famous sort of quote, I think someone said, AWS essentially, invented the rate card for IT. So everyone sort of all of a sudden got up and said, okay, we're going to have this interesting path, and what does it mean? So I think infrastructure was on everyone's mind and how you're going to deal with it. And then what was happening from sort of top down, the application side, there was a lot of activity in the SaaS space. So you had seen by then already some pretty large breakout companies. Salesforce is probably the most popular proxy for that time. And it had already gotten past the point of saying, well, it's about applications, business process being refactored and being run as a service anywhere. And what they were starting to deal with was actually, as developers had looked at whether it's .NET or Java or whatever the common sort of web-related technologies were, they were starting to think about, okay, so what are the tools that I need to build SaaS applications? And you had a popular flurry of sort of a bunch of apps. PHP was sort of off and running. But PaaS, Platform as a Service, was sort of hot back then at one level, 2008, 2009, 10. You had a bunch of players get into that space. And it was basically because in IT, infrastructure and operations were still kind of status quo, but developers were starting to think about, what do I do with this layer of web technology and web architectures, and how do I tie it to my knitting? And that one other piece that I'll talk about related to that was the whole space around sort of mobile. And I think the first kind of broad swath of sort of the app economy and how powerful mobile was going to be. I actually remember advising a startup that was doing MDM, mobile device management, back then in sort of the old school way of MDM. It's changed radically now, obviously. So I think those were some of the big infrastructure trends. You know, big data was nowhere on the horizon at one level. Analytics were big, and every one of the large vendors had done an analytics acquisition. But everyone still griped about a certain company's pricing around database. So you know, things have sort of stayed consistent, I guess, at one level. So I think virtualization, the mobile trend, infrastructure as a service, and what I would call the broad emergence of the developer separate, and the power that the developer started wielding when she or he were able to sort of break free and build tools and build applications rapidly on the web was a pretty important milestone from sort of reinventing IT as we think about it today.
So we had a lot of these changes that happened because of cost efficiencies in IT, as you guys talked about, the ability to get a more flexible model around some of your architectural things. But what has it done to impact the fundamental business models? As our audience thinks through their strategies on this stuff and how it, or can it, or should it change their business, where have you guys seen it impact businesses the most in terms of the business model, not just the cost model, but the actual way that the company does business? We'll start with you, Barry.
So clearly, the trajectory is different for different, I would like to say different market segments, but even within market segments, different for individual customers, depending on really how hungry and how painful your situation is. So the first stop always has been get the operational efficiencies, right, out of cloud. And there are an increasing number, increasingly so, I would say, from last year to this year, where they say, okay, how can it really help the business? And a lot of those, so just to cite a few IBM examples without any specific names, and a lot of that in the IBM umbrella is under the Smarter Planet theme and the Smarter Planet paradigm. And under that, one example would be smarter cities. So especially for governments, not necessarily new business models from a perspective of revenue and businesses, on managing cities, managing sewage systems, managing the electricity grid, managing where the water leaks are, those kind of aspects, right? So it is not it's not an IT play, it's a business model play on how the city, and it's happening at the level of the city because that is the atomic unit of construction of society, of governance of society. So that's one example. Another example, more to the business context, is there's this alliance called the Smart TV Alliance. So the world came from having a TV which was just a TV, and it beamed stuff one way, and that was it. So the Smart TV Alliance, a lot of it from Europe, but then also over here, and just to give you the context, has about a little over 25% of the market share of TVs in the US, and worldwide a little over 36, 37%, minus China. I don't know why the numbers were run that way. Worldwide minus China, that's the market share for the Smart TV Alliance. So in that is companies like LG and Panasonic and Philips and so on and so forth. So that's another example where the TVs are not just dumb OEM devices, but smart in the sense that they have connectivity, they have a hum, and the back end of that incidentally runs on the IBM Smart Cloud. But the point being that that's another area which is a change to the business model. Increasingly where we are seeing is these kind of plays. So what we've been talking, and in the conference also over here, I've been talking about the Internet of Things, getting the hum into the home appliances, getting the hum into the thermostats. And the back end for that, let's put that entire space in the mobile and wireless world, right? Not just smart devices. And the back end of that is not just cloud, but generating a whole new business models for companies that want to provide those services as an extension to those OEM devices.
So Biri, you're speaking from a pretty independent voice right now. Okay, fantastic use cases and examples. Is that required to be in the cloud? I mean, you spent the big part of your last 4 or 5 years trying to help companies understand what to move to the cloud and what not. And I know I don't want you to speak too much to a specific company, but when there's a tension in organizations between my hardware, my data center, my team, my control, versus relinquishing some of that, when is the right choice? Are these new business models dependent upon cloud, or do they just run better because of cloud? Or are they really, truly new opportunities that wouldn't be possible in a data center?
Yeah. The simple answer would be sort of all of the above. But there's a adoption and a transition mode in all of those, right? So back to the idea of sort of what are I'll just expand a little bit on to get to that question, Billy, is if you think about what is being disrupted or how traditional businesses have been affected by what we're calling cloud. So I think one of the obvious ones is IT as part of any business, bricks and mortar, all the way through content and publishers. You pick it, service providers around the world. IT has fundamentally been disrupted at a pretty basic level. And the emergence of the developer and IT operations line of business, the data scientist, all this. So there's an incredible opening up, and IT has gone from a cost curve and a operations view to now saying, hey, you need to be more agile and contribute to the bottom line, not just be a drag on it. And this sort of mystery, the black box of IT holding power, all that stuff, we're sort of actually seeing it unravel in front of us real time, which I think is very good. It's very empowering for kind of everyone at one level. Now, if you take that a step into saying, so is it a requirement is cloud essentially a requirement for a business to do, or does a business get to leverage cloud? I think it just depends on the use cases and how you adopt it. So if you look at sort of big data and analytics and the notion of databases and structured and unstructured and just that entire movement of big and fast data, one of the things I think is invariably going to happen, and we happen to be at a conference where this is, I think, being widely disseminated in a very good, innovative way, is we've been, I think, in IT, in the sort of IT world, we've been backwards looking in all of the applications and all the work we do. So the emergence of forward-looking data, whether it's Smarter Planet themes for large companies, all the way down to SMB, all the way to individual consumers now doing sort of Fitbit and fuel efficiency and sort of how they spend their energy during the day, and you pick it, right? It's become an analytics-minded view, and it's because we're interacting with a whole bunch of applications and data a lot more frequently. So I think that's invariably going to pull almost every business and every human that's empowered with a device and is sort of able to connect to a broader network to, I think, learn a lot about their environment and what they do and who they are and all of that good stuff. So at a basic level, I think the analytics piece of it has tremendous power of drawing people into the power of distributed computing. I think that definitely pulls you in. Whether you want it or not, you will be sort of having to deal with it. I've, for the last 5 years, maintained a very simple model for trying to understand this in my lens, all of this sort of cloud thing. So to me, the device is the front end, right? It's the form factor. We deal with it. Cloud infrastructure is the back end. It's sort of where you host and run and share your resources. We're dealing with applications. We interact with applications in a modern, much more socially informed, social network, web-centric way, right? So lightweight, kind of get it done devices. I immerse myself in a game. I follow someone. I pay someone. I check in. I do all these things through my sort of device. And so the applications and the interactions have become very different and very empowering. And finally, so device front end, cloud infrastructure back end, I'm interacting in a whole different way, as we say, systems of engagement or systems of experience versus systems of record. And I need analytics and a way to structure all of this information to make sense of it all. Whether I'm an enterprise, whether I'm a human, a consumer, a prosumer, I need information to sort of organize it. So I think in the sort of data lens, that's a natural draw. I think from an operational kind of point of view, in order to compete, cloud infrastructure, distributed computing, workloads spread across different availability zones and such is become table stakes. So if you're going to be a business and you're going to compete You have to start thinking about how you're sort of deploying your resources and what your basic infrastructure looks like. That's sort of a have to do. And again, my point about IT being completely disrupted here, it really goes back to that sort of commentary.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because one of the biggest challenges that a lot of our executives are facing is understanding the way that the nature of an application has changed. If you're an executive, then the odds are you've lived through the world where you understand, we used to talk about an exe that you would drop on a desk, and that was the application. The application was this very monolithic thing that you could touch, put on a disk, give to somebody else, install, and manage, right? In today's world, an application, the definition of an application is radically different. An application is a conglomerate of now services and components of applications that all interact together and work together, right? So, okay, great, but that creates real havoc from what you just said about resourcing and understanding and how to get all these things together. It sort of feels like the ship has sailed, that's just now the way apps are, and that's probably the way they're going to be. Cassandra adds fuel to that fire because it makes it easy across data centers and high availability zones, and now you have data pulling data gravity all over the place. So first, it is what it is, but is it a good thing or a bad thing? And I know you're going to say it depends, but like, what are the aspects that make it a good thing and make it a bad thing in this new world of everything distributed everywhere? And should people fear the cloud from this perspective, that it is relinquishing a lot of control? We had somebody say earlier that in one of our panels, now lines of business can take their toys and go home. If they don't like what IT is saying, they can go to a cloud, take out their credit card, put it on their budget, they're up and running. Now all of a sudden, you might have a mission critical app you didn't even know is now up and running in your organization on some cloud. So should we be afraid? Should we get control of that? Should we let it evolve?
Yep.
What mentality should businesses take? We'll start with you, Biri.
So I got a strong set of opinions here, and I'm vendor neutral now, so I'll be a bit more forthcoming at one level. So let me comment on this point about the adoption of distributed computing for a second, and I'm going to talk about it from the lens of compute, and then I'm going to touch upon sort of data and back to my commentary and sort of big data and where that's playing out. So if you look at, again, back to the last 5 years, the adoption of infrastructure and compute, we're all struggling right now. No one has proven out a stable compute infrastructure. So if you look at the camps around infrastructure, right, you got Amazon with AWS, you got VMware and EMC, that sort of stack. You got Citrix and CloudStack. You got the OpenStack players, and there's a handful of companies trying to come up with the right distribution there. And I only think one or two will sort of make it. And then there's the Microsoft stack, right? And that's essentially those 4 or 5. There's 1 or 2 others, perhaps. But what's happened is no one has solved that other than AWS's radical adoption of basic compute. So the bad thing in this, Billy, is you've got vendors essentially slowing down, I think, in bad behavior, the adoption of this, and no one's really solving the compute. It's against their interest to go solve compute so it's as elastic as it could be today. It's against their interest. It blows up entire businesses, billions of dollars of sort of legacy maintenance business models today. So this has been part of my frustration in the last 4 or 5 years, and part of my work on this, that the compute side of all of infrastructure, when I say that, I mean compute, storage, data, and networking, has been the least open to being sort of innovative and radicalized. Not so on the big data side, because it's kind of largely been white space. So you've seen massive adoption of storage, next generation databases, next generation analytics, all touching on the themes I talked about earlier on. So I think the work, and so the average CIO is frustrated on the compute piece, where they're saying, look, I've got workloads that were built for mission critical apps in the old days that are basically web anxious infrastructure, right, or architectures. They're monolithic, sort of the compute is tied to the networking, is tied to storage and mission critical, bare metal, all the way up to sort of the application logic, and it's big iron. And it's sold at very expensive economics, and it takes a shitload of sort of work to maintain and manage on an annual basis. And it's a very expensive value prop when you compare that against web-friendly workloads that are completely distributed, that are built, essentially the developers writing these apps designed them expecting failure of the underlying infrastructure, whether it's the network, whether it's storage, whether it's the compute layer. They're built to, quote unquote, expect failure. Yeah. And so if you take mobile and big data and you couple that with that theory, you've seen an explosion of web-based apps. You've seen a whole bunch of web-based companies succeed. And it's basically speaking to the point that workloads, mission critical and or business critical workloads, have been slow to adopt because of this fact. But you've got this explosion. Take mobile, take big data, take sort of the next generation storage. Because compute is moving slowly, you've had this complete explosion of innovation happening there. So the long-winded answer is, I think it's a very good thing. The future is, quote-unquote, distributed as we know it, and it's a very good thing for, I think, a whole bunch of innovation. It's bad behavior by the existing vendors, which I think will change. There's a whole bunch of disruption that is happening. But I think it's holding, quote-unquote, the industry back, and it's holding IT practitioners back. And you can see it. You can see it in IT operations versus data scientists versus mobile people versus developers of applications. And you can see the sort of tension in business amongst that sort of very point. So I think it's, it is getting exposed. It's getting more transparent, but there's still a ways to go on it.
We had, before I get to your answer, Gurvi, we had a discussion yesterday about, to your point about bad behavior, we've seen that extended down into the organization such that often the developer teams who know better, the ones who have architected the product and who have spec'd it out, will submit a procurement request, and what will come back is exactly opposite of what the team said they needed, because some team said, no, this is our big data box. Well, who told them that? A vendor, right? So they're not delivering what they need, and it stifles the growth and innovation of the actual project itself. So I totally understand what you're saying with that. Gurvi, from your perspective, it is now, I think we all admit, a fully distributed world. Good thing, bad thing? You've seen good cases of this and bad cases of this. You live in the implementation side, so what should we be aware of?
Tremendously good stuff coming out of this, with riveted attention to the value to the customer, right? No doubt about that. Biri was very eloquent in his thinking and point of view, and he touched on one of the threads, Billy, that you raised. I want to pick on another thread that you raised in your earlier question, and that was around the impact to the applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I've done some deep and hard thinking on this topic, and here's the way I frame it. If we go back 15 years, when it was still largely a client-server kind of an environment, right? What .com did is it gave an acceleration to the way applications were being built. It gave a massive acceleration. Nothing happened to the infrastructure, quite frankly. We were still using client-server kind of infrastructure, right, with .com web-based technologies. So massive move forward as far as applications is concerned. And then you come into the world, into the era that was ignited by VMware and hypervisors. That's what accelerated and brought up to par the infrastructure, right? So the lower substructure then accelerated in terms of its technology innovation. That's where we are today. That's where all the cloud providers are providing. That's where a lot of the building blocks for on-premise clouds is also being provided. Yes, there are struggles in undertaking that journey. But now what's happening is part of what Biri raised, which is the system engagement and the mobile devices, not just mobile devices from the context of smartphones, but I extend the thinking towards the entire Internet of Things, including smartphones. That on the top of the sandwich, and the cloud-based infrastructure at the bottom of the sandwich is causing a whole disruption to the paradigm on how applications need to be built. So we have discussions around in this conference and every conference you go to on cloud-native applications. So what's now happening is that the infrastructure got built out and is being built out with much innovation, and the application build-out now has to sort of reoccur. The new build-out of applications has to. And these applications will continue to be distributed. There will be more attention that will need to be paid on how these applications, either systems of record, which are repurposed onto the cloud, or systems of engagement, which are natively developed for the cloud, or I might add a third, situational applications that are built for ad hoc behavior and ad hoc business needs, and how these have to be placed, and you look at it as a portfolio view, how these have to be placed on what kind of an infrastructure, what kind of a substructure. So the nature of these applications is going to be increasingly distributed, increasingly, I would like to say parallel, because that's another area where a particular component in the infrastructure, and that is processor technology, push the envelope way out. And we have multi-core that is there, increasing the density, but not necessarily the applications marshalling the advantages of multi-core. So as this build-out of applications happens, it's going to start leveraging the infrastructure much better and much differently. So you need a different application paradigm.
So it's great. Let me dive into some. Part of the value of executives hearing a presentation like this is, just quite candidly, it arms you with a better vocabulary when you go into meetings with other people in your organization. Because for you guys, yesterday, a lot of our themes have been the technology isn't the problem at the moment. A lot of it is the people in the organizations. That tends to be the problem. And so what we've been trying to really ferret out in these discussions is, how do we help people organizationally grease the skids to make the changes they know they need to make? Having the proper dialogue is a big part of that. And while this sounds very trite, it's very true. And I bet if we're all honest, we've all been in a situation where you walk into a meeting and a really smart guy like Gertie starts talking and he starts throwing out some terms. I don't really know what he means. So I'm just gonna turtle up. I'm just gonna be quiet and act like I don't know. Because if I say the wrong thing, then I'm gonna look like an idiot, and I don't want to lose my power in the organization. System of record, system of engagement, system of interaction. What the frick are you talking about, right? We've had online applications, real-time applications, web applications. Now we got a whole new categorization of applications. What do you mean when you say that? Because really, guys, I'm telling you, this is you guys know it. You see this. You go in and start dumbing down people with the language, and all of a sudden, they disengage. So what do you mean when you're talking about these different types of systems? You brought it up.
I brought it up?
You clarified.
I got to take it out of the rat hole. Let me take it through an example. Something that we all deal with all the time. Point of sales, right? The last time you checked out a supermarket, there are certain things that happen at the point of sales. And if we dissect that, you look at the mix of things that are happening, and I'll extend it to the system of engagement in just a moment. You're swiping your credit card. Well, before that, the cashier is pulling up the pricing, which is pulling from some catalog. It's ringing up the register, so on and so forth. It's also pulling from those kind of applications, which traditionally are your system of record applications. That's where your SKUs are. That's where your pricing is. That's where your largely non-volatile information is. That's where your largely structured data is, right? Now, granted, pricing will go up and down. You've got to respond to the market. You've got to respond to competition. That dynamics is also there. But also what ties into a point of sale scenario is, let's say, your affinity programs, your loyalty programs. So when you check in, it's pulling in from that application as well, right? It's pulling in from that application because it now has to reprice or give you the appropriate discounts or give you the appropriate points based on your affinity, based on the loyalty program. It doesn't stop there. If you look behind the receipt of your grocery checkout, what do you see over there? You see coupons, right? That's an analytic kind of a workload, right? So earlier ones like transactional workloads, like credit card, which is later something that you pull, and that analytics on how do they spit out those kind of coupons. And it's not at random. It's done based on a certain profiling they've done based on your buyer behavior, your buying behaviors, right? So if you look at this mix that I talked about, it's pulling in multiple workloads into a certain scenario, into a certain workflow. And that's where really the crown jewels and the business value is, in bringing these multiple applications, whether they're coming in from system of records or system of engagement, and I promise to make the connection to that. And if you take point of sales today and the Square example, where you can walk into a Starbucks, and if you have the Square app on your phone, there is no ringing up of the cash register at Starbucks, right? So that experience, so that is the system of engagement where you have a Square application which has sensed, and that is a volatile kind of sensing, which has sensed your presence into a Starbucks and knows what you likely want and doesn't need to even ring up the register because it will automatically charge you in the back. That make sense?
It does. And this is what makes it so difficult for executives who are trying, who have, many of our executives have their teams that are pushing them for change, right? So it's coming bottom up. Often they've already implemented some of the stuff in the cloud, maybe some of the stuff on premise, maybe all of one or the other, sometimes a combination. Then what becomes really challenging is when you talk about, again, that application, that point of sale application. Well, the point of sale application is really now a conglomeration of all these things, right? So it's difficult to say that application, and this is where the database discussion in particular gets very challenging, because you are going to have multi-databases. When I say multi, I mean multi-types of databases behind the same application. We used to talk about polyglot programmers who used multiple languages. Now I think it's appropriate to talk about polyglot persistence, where you're going to have persisted data on a whole bunch of different technologies spread across all over the place, right? So when you think about that world of the divergence of all this data across all these systems, you know, Biri, this can be a very complicated discussion for an architect who may be afraid of changing that old paradigm of, well, wait a minute, if I let my business start building in the cloud and on that database, the data has gravity, right? I mean, talk a little bit about data gravity. What does that mean when we say the data is going to live where it's going to live because it's too heavy to start moving back around? Is it okay that some of it lives in the cloud and always stays in the cloud, never comes back, or should there be things that should be taboo that should not be in the cloud ever in terms of the data? How does an architect start thinking about these things?
Yep. So I think back to Guri's really good example on point of sale and systems of record and systems of engagement. So a couple of things around building on that, right? So the notion of data gravity has emerged of late in that it's made, two things are happening. From the big data being able to manipulate large unstructured data sets, the open data initiatives, whether it's .gov and or all the way through, you're essentially having a ton of access and a bunch of tools, largely through open source initiatives, very rapidly building core infrastructure with which you can now manage and assemble and get the benefit of large data sets anywhere. And the relative requirements of the resources underneath are pretty nimble at this point. So, and then the first example of data gravity has always been Amazon S3, right? It's been, once you got there, essentially it was sort of, you checked in, a bunch of startups got there because their VCs told them that's where you're going to spend your CapEx as OpEx, and I don't want you buying stuff. And then they realized, SmugMug's a great example of someone who has struggled. It's a very small operation, massive online presence, and they can't get out of S3 if they wanted to. And so they've decided to live with it. Others are sort of figuring this out. That's just a very sort of simple example of the stickiness of data gravity. It's just hard to manage. And then the value of it is super important. I think the same example happens in today's enterprise and businesses that have traditional systems of record. It's an SQL database or set of databases distributed, and they're incredibly valuable. And they have mission critical systems tuned on top of them. So they're not about to get sort of turned around anytime soon. So there's an entire sort of ecosystem built on the fact that these things persist. And I think what's happening is top-down analytics, and the way you're structuring especially the unstructured side of growth is completely opening up the sort of fallacy of data stickiness. It's actually saying, well, if you're smart about it, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist, you can be an average data architect, you can be a meaningful mid-level data scientist in an organization, or even an ex-DBA that's moved up through this evolution and actually make smart decisions on how to get there. So I think the data gravity issue right now is largely a function of traditional IT. I'm speaking of enterprise, not necessarily S3, with the enterprise. Basically not having the tools or not feeling empowered to have the tools. I think that's changing now with the fact that you've actually got very different types of databases and data sets being made available and running a whole bunch of new applications. Back to my point about reactive backward systems, the entire business ecosystem of client server has engendered a set of database companies that built workflow and business process that was always backwards looking, right? The entire Smarter Planet thesis from 2008, I happened to be there when it was launched by John Ibarra and the IBM team. And you know, the thesis of sort of big data today is the future of applications are going to be proactive, and the applications are going to be built on the fact that they have immediate access to large sets of data with which to now engage decision points, make decisions with, right? It's the entire thesis for Billy's company at one level. And if you think about it from that standpoint, it'll reshape the entire workflow and the way we are oriented to thinking about interacting with applications. Back to point of sale, right? And you're seeing two examples. Point of sale that Guri talked about is about the vendor providing enough value so that as a consumer, I get value and I buy and I upsell, so my average transaction has value. The other extreme example is on the consumer side largely is Google through an ad base, right? Where every sort of interaction, whether it's through Android or Chrome or online, you're having some kind of smart serve up an ad, and you know they've got that economy sort of very well, you know, locked down. So I think there's as much as the issue of data gravity is there, it's actually engendering a whole bunch of new behavior, largely through mobile, largely the fact of ease of access through, you know, data sets and the underlying kind of distributed architectures that are now being made very easily accessible. And then number three, the power of sort of IT teams to finally wake up and say, wait, I've got developers, polyglot application guys running off, and now I can actually start thinking of life and my teams as polyglot persistent, right? And I can actually manage multiple sets. I think those are very powerful forces coming together to really sort of unleash a very different way of the way we're all going to quote unquote conduct business. And I think the Square example sort of nails it.
One common theme we've seen over and over again, it's not an either-or world, right? It really is going to be a world of both and. We're going to see all these things kind of come together. And you mentioned SmugMug. It's funny. I'm a SmugMug user. It's a photo site. And it's data gravity in my personal life, because now it'd be tough for me to unwind 4 years from SmugMug, you know, and I do worry about the date. What if, you know, like it's all there for me now, and I got to figure out ways to share it. So I use the mobile app, and it's a very real concept even in our personal lives. Because we're accumulating so much data. So I'm going to pause before we come on final approach here. Are there any questions that we can address from the audience? Yes?
I'd like to ask a question about storage. You mentioned storage several times in the context of cloud stability. Can you speak more to that subject, and specifically the shortcomings in the current cloud storage ecosystem that you see?
Sure. So the question's about storage and double-clicking on where is storage going relative to kind of cloud architectures and adoption. Yeah. This is another favorite topic. So if it's not obvious, I'm sort of a bit bearish on the compute side of innovation right now. And I think where we've seen it obviously is in mobile and big data. But I think the other thing happening right now is quietly storage side and to a limited extent networking has really sort of taken the ball and moved it forward. So when I think of storage in the cloud, there's a couple of things happening. There's sort of the primary store that all the traditional vendors are geared up to go serve, right? Primary sort of storage piece. That's the world of EMC NetApp. They've sort of sat there, and you know, there's a set of models that I think are being very readily disrupted. I think what's happening in storage right now on that front is the power of NAND and SSD to basically accelerate the performance, price performance of storage as a primary store point is going through massive sort of innovation. If you look at the last 18 months of you know, startups being funded, and you did the calculus on what they're going after, they're doing 3-4 very simple applications, dedupe and virtualization and one or two other things, but they're building it on brand new architectures, mostly SSD arrays, designed to basically accelerate what? The spinning disk and more performance out of it at price points that matter. So I think that's what's happening on sort of the primary store. Beyond that, at the object sort of file level, you're seeing big ecosystems come out. So S3 certainly done, you know, a bunch of very good work. But if you look at OpenStack and you look at some of the things being done in Swift and the ecosystem, especially around Swift, there's a ton of innovation happening. There's companies like Inktank or Ceph that are basically coming up with, I think, faster, better ways to do large scale, you know, object. And I think, by the way, the future to me of storage is NAS to the cloud. We're going to have an on-premise piece that translates file, objects, the block, all of that into the cloud. And I think the common thesis is most service providers feel like storage in the cloud is going to be largely elastic. Here's my last point on this. I think there's a massive oversight of core storage. So if you look at spinning disk, Seagate, WD and basically Toshiba are the 2.5 players in that space. And then you look at SSD, there's a bunch of players sort of coming out. There's a massive data capacity shortage projected by 2020. No one can figure out whether it's going to be 2 zettabytes or 5 zettabytes, but it's going to be massive. We know this. We can sense it in just the amount of data we're producing as individuals. So there's a massive sort of CapEx issue in the future of storage around the thesis that says, yeah, storage is going to essentially be free or virtually free, completely elastic. And I don't think the industry has necessarily reconciled that. So at hyperscale storage, there's going to be capacity constraints, and I think there's going to be a very interesting balance between how fast NAND and SSD innovates to overcome the basic price performance of spinning disk that I don't think is going away for 10 years. It's pretty persistent in sort of the core storage. So that's some of the observations I've seen.
Cody, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so if we go back in computing, there was about a 6x differential between CPU speed and storage speed. And Biri is absolutely on the money in his remarks and as well as his bullish choices. That flash storage has bridged that gap. And now it's a matter of milliseconds, nanoseconds kind of a discussion. And so what I'd build on top of Biri, your discussion is the impact that would have to the nature of applications that are going to run. Other than the fact that latency comes down, so the whole truck doesn't get slowed, right? The whole convoy doesn't get slowed because of this delta in between. Once you bridge that gap, that's going to have back to how applications are changing, and back to what this conference is about, and data stacks is also about, is how databases are changing. So they'll be more flat. They'll be more easily accessible from latency standpoint. And that comes back to really the title of this discussion, which is the agility around how quickly you can respond based on that querying and several use cases and scenarios around it.
So finish that thought on the concept of go further and let's go out 3 years now. We're 3 years from now and we're kind of having this discussion. What does it look like? What have we changed in our thinking? Aspirationally, where should people be driving as they think about these architectures and clouds and applications? Where do you see the world different in 3 years from where it is today?
So there is the school of, there is the camp of argument and some merit to it where the infrastructure is getting commoditized, right? I'm not going to argue that. But there is also an equally important decision to be made by everybody. And that is, how are you going to place your data and your applications on what infrastructure? That's going to be a really key discussion, because now, even though there's commoditization of the infrastructure, if I were to give merit to that argument and leave it alone for a moment, but you do have discrimination between the infrastructure. So where this is going, the way I see it now, is if you look at flash storage, I think the price point around it is around $11 to $12 per gig. And if you go back 2 to 3 years, that was the price point for tier 1 storage, right? So you're getting flash storage today at what tier 1 storage cost was. 3 years from now, Moore's law is clearly in play over here, and we can see the economics of that becoming very, very accessible at massive levels, right? So the discussion will then come back around, not just a cloud provider, but what are the pods? What is the nature of the hardware running in those pods that the cloud provider is providing to you, or what you are building in your infrastructure, right? Because that's going to depend on your ability to run the new nature of applications and databases that you are running, either within a location or across multiple locations and multiple nodes.
Will I be comfortable with multiple cloud providers? Will we get to that? Because right now it's kind of you pick one and you're done. Will we be there yet?
Yeah. So very, very important point, Billy, that you raise, and not just from the IBM perspective, but from a personal perspective. And I think from a, I've been on both sides of the fences earlier from a consumer standpoint, from a consumer of IT. I've been in business units earlier when I was giving you my system engineering wireless background. Lock-in is a barrier right now, right? I mean, you talked about your example where you're storing your pictures, right?
Yep.
So lock-in is a barrier right now. But it's not just from the perspective of lock-in to a particular provider, meaning be able to switch. I mean, where were we with phone number portability 10 years back, right? Right? That was a difficult problem in this country. Where are we today with the hard coupling of cell phone instruments to the providers? That is still a problem in this country today, for the most part. The rest of the world has moved ahead on that decoupling. So the hard coupling between an application and infrastructure, or at a more macro level, between the workload and the provider, right, is not a desirable thing from a value standpoint to a customer. You can go into the risk and the probability and the switching costs and some of the keynote discussions that were touched yesterday morning, right? How plausible and how probable is it for a customer to do it? But everybody desires the latitude to be able to do it. The second point I'll make is it's not just about switching, but I think more importantly in a runtime steady state is the integration across cloud providers. I think the switching and the portability across cloud providers is going to be important, and that's based around the standards and some of the points and some of the players that Biri talked about, right? The ironing of the standards will happen. But it's more the integration of the workflows across providers. Because when you look at your end state environment, let's say 2-3 years from now, it's not going to be your enterprise, just your enterprise. It's not going to be just one provider. It's going to be this portfolio of multiple providers, and some at IaaS, some at PaaS, and then also your enterprise in the mix. But back to my point of sale example, your workflows have to integrate regardless of where the deployment is going to be.
Biri, anything to add to that? A couple points where you think we'll be?
So if I were to say 3-5 years from now, I think you'll have, I think you, Billy, will have one extra zero in your total attendees attending your conference.
I'm my singular fan. Thank you.
I'd say that's a safe bet based on what certainly we've seen. I think one of the biggest issues going forward is identity. Our identity, our avatar online, and a singular identity. The devices are all sort of done and solved, but our identity and one that is true and secure is going to be a massive issue, and I don't think anyone's close to solving it. If you just look at the last 2 weeks of what's hitting the news, privacy is dead, long live privacy, and I think there's going to be massive issues around that. Forget data governance at the broad economic country, state level. This is going to become a very hard-hitting issue for us, and I don't think anyone's thinking about it anywhere close to the level of maturity it needs. So I think privacy and the focus of online identity go hand in hand and will be a major issue for a few years to come. The infrastructure stuff, the standards, some of that stuff, business needs will drive a bunch of cooperation on it, but these are some serious public policy issues that are in front of us, and it's an interesting place to be. So I think that would be my big question mark going in. I think a lot of the other stuff we're dealing with, there's natural trend lines for them. So.
Great. Well, Biri, thank you very much for coming. You guys were a great help. We've got lunch for you guys. Food trucks are out there and ready, and then obviously the eating back in the main hall. So. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you guys again for your time.
Thanks for having us. All right, thank you.